Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'd like to take a couple seconds here really quick and start out by telling a story. In 2012, Lenya Avery Lusko, the daughter of Levi and Jenny Lusko, had a severe asthma attack while she was at a party a few days before Christmas. She had her inhaler with her, and for whatever reason, when she took the inhaler, for whatever reason, the medicine didn't work. It didn't reverse the effects of the asthma attack. And within a few hours, Lenya passed away. And Levi and Jenny Lusko were now suddenly faced with this impossible decision that kind of reversed how Christmas should be. Because instead of thinking about last-minute Christmas gifts that they could get for their daughter, they were now thinking, what kind of casket should we get? What should be on her tombstone? What kind of clothes should we bury her in? The gifts that they had already gotten for her that were wrapped would be left behind as a dark reminder of every Christmas that they were never going to have with their daughter again. And for years, this would trouble them. It still pains them to this day. And as distressing as this reality was for the Lusko family, somehow, some way, they managed to survive. Levi is a pastor at Fresh Life Church in Montana, and he went on just a few days after his daughter's passing to preach at their Christmas Eve services. And there are a lot of people who wouldn't really know how to carry on with their lives. They wouldn't know what direction to go. They wouldn't know how to feel or how to respond. But Levi and his family, they have allowed God to use this tragedy to encourage millions and to continue to show how God is able to work through the worst of circumstances. Levi went on to write a book called Through the Eyes of a Lion. And in that book, he recounts that horrible day when his daughter passed. He talks about arriving at the party, performing CPR himself, trying to keep her heart beating. The ride in the ambulance, talking with the doctors. He talks about the weeks after and the emotional turmoil that his family went through. He talks about how their lives were altered in the wake of that. And he also talks about what God has done for and through him and his family since that day. They made a conscious choice not to be selfish with their pain and to allow God to bring good out of their tragedy. Now, the truth is that loss is an unavoidable part of life on this planet, but we can have hope because Jesus has power over death. 2 Timothy 1:10, it says that Jesus broke the power of death and illuminated the way to life and immortality through the gospel. But what should we take this to mean? And how should we understand this? Because people still die. People still die, and we still feel the pain that's associated with that loss. So how are we to respond? Well, the interesting thing is that Jesus, while he was the one who would go on to destroy the power of death, he still felt the pain of death and the pain of loss when his friend Lazarus passed away. And so for those of us who are unsure of how to feel when it comes to the pain of loss or how to react, we should take comfort in the fact that Jesus went through this as well. Emotion is consistent with Jesus' character. It really is. It's consistent. He expressed anger when people disrespected the temple, when he flipped over tables and made a whip and drove people out for being so disrespectful and basically making it a place to make money and rip people off. So anytime people ask, hey, what would Jesus do? Remind them that sometimes flipping table and pushing people out is an appropriate response. Jesus often expressed compassion towards other people, especially when they came to him in the heat of the day. He expressed sadness at the state of the nation of Israel. He was very much a person of emotion. And so the point I want to make here today is that every person should feel the pain associated with loss because of the following expressions of Jesus' emotion. The first expression to the pain of loss that Jesus displayed was compassion. It was compassion. Now, the story of the resurrection of Lazarus is one that is loaded with emotion. It's loaded with emotion. It's all over the place. Lazarus' two sisters, Mary and Martha, they were torn up and broken by the death of their brother, and understandably so. Who wouldn't be? The disciples, they were upset because they considered Lazarus to be a really close friend. And then Jesus himself, though he planned to use this moment as an opportunity to show the power of God, he still felt some very strong emotions during this event. And one of the first ones that we see from him is compassion. Now, this story, it's in John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44, and it records this entire story. Now, for our purposes, we're only going to be focusing on a few sections of that chapter, and we're going to be looking at the ones that specifically detail some of Jesus' emotion. Now, when Jesus arrived in Bethany, which is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus all lived, Lazarus had already been dead a few days. And so it seemed final, because it's been a few days, he hasn't gotten, dead is dead, he hasn't gotten better. It seemed so final. And so when Martha hears that Jesus has arrived, she runs to meet him. She runs to meet him. And when she gets there, she confronts him. John 11:21, it tells us what she said. Then Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Your brother will rise again." Now, this is Jesus' way of revealing his plan to Martha. He's basically giving her a knowing wink, saying, this is all part of the plan. Your brother will rise again, Jesus told her. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now, in this moment, Jesus here is telling Martha, hey, I have power over death. Like, death isn't final. This is my arena. And so Jesus is basically telling Martha, hey, I've got power over this. It's okay. She comes back with, yes, Lord, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who comes into the world. Now, as of yet in the story, Jesus hasn't shown much compassion. I mean, he's shown compassion by showing up, but he hasn't really shown compassion in the way that we're going to see. Now, enter Mary, because her reaction to hearing that Jesus has arrived is completely different than Martha's. Now, there are some similarities. She hears that Jesus is there, and she runs to meet him, but their postures are far different. Martha stands before Jesus, and Mary kneels at him, or at his feet. She falls to the ground at his feet, and she essentially says the same thing to him. Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. If you had just been here, my brother would still be alive. And it's at this moment that we see Jesus' compassion. We see this in John 11:33. When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Now, this is important, because here, Jesus is moved with compassion towards all those who were there to mourn the death of Lazarus. It's here that he expresses compassion through action. Something that's worth mentioning is found in the way the New King James Version translates this verse. It says, Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. That groaning is thought to be like the angry bellow of an upset horse. And I love the imagery that creates, because this is literally Jesus being so moved with compassion that he lets out this exasperated sigh, just the sort of, ugh, a kind of frustrated sigh. Now, Jesus did express himself in anger here in this passage, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but I just wanted to point that it was compassion that led him to action in the first place. Now let's talk about the shortest verse in the Bible, because in that verse, we see another expression of Jesus' emotion, and that expression is sorrow. Jesus expressed himself in sorrow. The shortest verse in the Bible is John 11:35. It says, Jesus wept. 2 words. And those 2 words hold so much significance. There's a lot of speculation as to why Jesus wept here, and it ranges from anything to Jesus being upset about the unbelief of the crowds to Him being sad that he knew he was about to effectively recall Lazarus out of heaven. But I think that there's another possible and frankly a more plausible explanation for why Jesus wept, and it's very simple. He was distraught. I think he was distraught. I mean, we already saw that Jesus was moved with such a strong compassion that he decided to act. But we can't forget that he's still experiencing the loss of a friend and all of the emotion that comes with it. Lazarus died. His sisters are experiencing intense agony. And full of compassion, Jesus can't help but to feel the same emotions, and it causes him to weep. Now, when it comes to the loss of a loved one, Levi Lusko doesn't really mince any words. He uses very descriptive language when he talks about the pain. He describes it as sorrow upon sorrow, like wave after wave of agony. In the bluntest of terms, Levi says it's basically like hell. Like if you can imagine hell on earth, it's the pain that you feel at the loss of a loved one. Now, this language that Levi uses, it's not exactly his own. He borrows a lot of it from Paul when Paul is talking about a friend of his who almost died. Now, imagine that. Paul's talking about a friend who almost died in those terms, sorrow upon sorrow. He's talking about his friend Epaphroditus. We read this in Philippians 2:22. He says, "For indeed he was sick, almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." Loss is painful. There is no sugarcoating it. It's painful. It's wave after wave of agony. That's the perfect description of sorrow. It's just pain. Because you can be fine 1 minute. You can be going all right and just feeling okay about yourself. And then the next minute you can be a crumpled heap of tears on the floor. It's sorrow upon sorrow. It's wave after wave after wave of agony. And this is an appropriate expression to the pain of loss. Jesus wept, and it was the compassion and sorrow that he felt that people took notice of. John 11:35 through 37, it says this, "Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.' And some of them said, 'Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, also have kept this man from dying?' Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb." Now these people, they were so caught up in their emotions and the pain of that moment that when Jesus expressed himself, the response of the people was praise and questions. They praised him for expressing the love he felt for Lazarus in such an audible and visible way. And yet there were others who questioned, why didn't you do anything sooner? I mean, why did you wait so long? After all, if you love Lazarus, why didn't you try to save him? You can heal people from blindness. Why couldn't you have done this sooner? And it's here that Jesus again reminds everyone why he waited. As he goes to the tomb, he tells them, remove the stone, roll it away. And Martha goes, hold up, wait a minute. She protests. And she says, you know what, it's been 4 days, and I know how my brother gets after not showering for 4 days. He gets kind of smelly, and we don't want to do that because he's already begun to decompose, and it would have smelled awful. And Jesus, he responds to her by saying, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Now at these words, they remove the stone, and Jesus prays. He thanks God for always hearing him, and he says, it's not for my benefit that I say this, is for theirs, so that they would see the power that you have. After he prays, he commands Lazarus, come forth, come out of there. And Lazarus, he does. He ambles out of the tomb, and they unwind him. Now, I've saved this next expression for last because I feel like it's one of the most misunderstood emotions that there is. The final expression of Jesus to the pain of loss is anger. It's anger. Anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions in general. And when it comes to loss, it can be one of the most motivating. All of Jesus' actions after arriving in Bethany can be traced to anger. Anger when John says that Jesus groaned in his spirit. It's an audible expression of anger. Again, it's been defined as the agitated snorting of an angry horse. If you've ever heard a horse when it's annoyed and that snorting it does, that kind of sound, that's what Jesus is doing here. He's letting out this exasperated sigh. He's angry. And while Jesus is our hope in the face of death, in Levi Lusko's words, in that moment, Jesus was angry that we would need such a hope to begin with. He's not angry that we have hope. He's angry that we would have a reason to need hope. He's angry that he's got to look at the grave and see what it's doing. He's furious. He's furious about sin. He's furious about death. And he is furious at the devil. And he was furious about the grave. But Jesus wasn't just angry. It's not enough to just be angry. Jesus was angry enough to do something about it. And Jesus is doing something as a result of his anger. It wasn't just to raise Lazarus from the dead, because Lazarus eventually was going to die again. And so it wasn't just to raise Lazarus from the dead. Jesus is doing something. His ultimate expression of anger was his final destruction of death and bringing immortality and life to light through the gospel. The ultimate expression of this anger was going to the cross and dying for us and rising from the grave 3 days later, thus destroying the power of death and giving the ultimate display of his power over death. When we find ourselves faced with the pain of loss, learning from Jesus is never the wrong way to go. Jesus expressed compassion. He was full of compassion. It allowed him to minister well among people who were also feeling the sting of loss. It's the moment where we feel the sting, but we allow ourselves to feel it. We show some vulnerability when we allow ourselves to feel this particular expression of loss. Jesus expressed himself in sorrow as well. He expressed himself in sorrow. This is where he didn't hole up. He didn't shove it down. He didn't bottle it up. He expressed it. If he were to put words to what he was feeling, I'm sure Jesus would have said, "Man, this hurts." Sometimes the best thing that we can do is to just be honest and say, "God, this hurts. I'm unhappy about this. I feel pain. I feel sadness." Finally, Jesus expressed himself in anger. Anger is an important emotion. And it's important that we feel it because it can motivate us to action. When it comes to the pain of loss, anger can give us focus and clarity, and it can give us determination. It was in some of the angriest moments in the wake of Lenya Avery's death that Levi Lusko was able to continue pushing the love of Christ. In spite of his sorrow, in spite of his anger, in spite of the pain he felt, Levi was able to trust that God was somehow going to work this out to bring out some good, and that he was able to trust God with his emotion. He didn't have to hide from God and say, "No, I'm okay with this." He was able to go directly to God and say, "God, this hurts, this sucks, I feel like hell, and I need some help." Levi was able to trust God that this loss wasn't in vain, and that God would somehow use it to bring glory to himself. Loss sucks. There is no pretty way to say that. But by looking at Jesus' expression of emotion in the face of loss, we can learn how to process that pain well. And that's an important lesson that we can learn. Jesus, he gave us some really great examples of what compassion looks like, of what sorrow looks like, of what anger used appropriately looks like. One excellent source for me is as a person who has dealt with that pain, has been looking at the willingness of the Lusko family to use their sorrow for God's glory. Their willingness to allow God to work through the pain and the anguish that they feel. Let's pray. Lord God, I thank you so much that You have destroyed death. God, I'm grateful that while we may have to still feel the sting of it, ultimately it has no power over us because of Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. God, we ask that you would just be with us. Lord, as we struggle with loss, as we struggle with pain, God, I ask that you would help us to keep these examples of what it looks like to express these emotions well in front of our minds. God, help us to remember you. Help us to remember that you're not unfamiliar with this pain, that this hurt isn't something that you don't know or you don't understand. God, we're so thankful that you have not left us alone on this earth and that you don't leave us to wallow in our pain. God, we're so grateful. We love you and we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for your time.